Good afternoon. Thanks, Lou, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank IGES, the other board members, and Steve for including the National Fusion Center Association in your event here. I'm going to take a few minutes here to give some remarks, but I got to do the obligatory disclaimer when I do so that the remarks given here are pretty much my remarks. They don't reflect the opinion of any one fusion center, and they obviously don't reflect the opinion of the Department of Homeland Security where I used to work. But we did include a lot of the material that DHS does with fusion centers in the remarks here so that give you a broad spectrum. So I'm going to cover 4 basic topics around fusion centers today. And I apologize in advance to some in the audience that are probably intimately familiar with the operations of fusion centers, and this may be repetitive to some of you. But I want to give everyone here at least a basic understanding of these 4 key areas around fusion centers. So with that in mind, the 4 areas I'll cover today is going to be what is a fusion center and how did they come to be? Because there's a big misconception of what a fusion center is, and we use these terms DHS fusion centers all the time. It was even done during the introduction here. And I even find myself making that mistake every once in a while. But they're not DHS fusion centers. They are recognized by DHS, but they're state and locally operated and owned. And that's a very key point that we'll talk about here in a minute. The second thing I'd like to talk about is what do we mean when we say this national network of fusion centers? You hear a lot of people saying that term, and what do we mean when we actually use that term? And then of great interest perhaps to some in this audience is what does the fusion center market look like? What is it trending? What kind of dollars are going towards fusion centers? What's the color of the money? I was at DHS in the heyday of the grant programs where you mentioned we were allocating $10.1 billion a year signing checks in preparedness and disaster grant programs annually. That number has obviously come down, but if those of you that are following the grant programs this year, there was a significant increase, unexpected increase this year in both the State Homeland Security Grant Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative Program. So that should be good news for not only fusion centers, but for the overall domestic Homeland Security marketplace in general. And finally, I'll give a brief glimpse into what I see the future trends for fusion centers and talk about a couple of projects that we have underway in the National Fusion Center Association. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, the folks that support us in these initiatives are our federal partners, folks like the program manager for the information sharing environment that provide funding to not our organization, but partner organizations that go out and do innovative projects to look at where fusion centers need to go. Whether you're talking about cyber, I know that was talked about earlier today, or talking about, we'll talk a little bit about centers of analytic excellence, national priority cells, and things of that nature. It's really important that our federal partners get recognition for the support that they do provide to fusion centers. Before I jump into all these topics, I want to also tell you briefly a little bit about the Fusion Center Association itself. We're a bit different than most of our public safety and emergency management associations. When we started the association, and it kind of had an interesting start. As I was leaving the Department of Homeland Security, I was kind of voluntold by Secretary Napolitano that there's this loose group of folks out there that need representation outside of government. They need to come together and have their own way of representing themselves, and so she basically told me I had to do this. So went out, we started the association. We modeled it after what some of you may know, the National Narcotics Officers Associations Coalition, which was then led by Ron Brooks, who was also the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, the Northern California Fusion Center at the time. And we kind of used that model as a way of a successful model of starting an association. And what we did is we incorporated it as a 501c6, which means we're a nonprofit. However, we can advocate on the Hill, both with Congress as well as with senior federal officials, with a registered government affairs firm. And we utilize, you've heard from Ben, and we utilize Ben Bodden, as many other public safety groups do, to represent us that way and advocate on our behalf, organize this when we doing testimony and things of that nature. So the association is made up, really, it's a very lean organization. It's made up of myself, Glenn Archer over here, who many of you know. Glenn and I are former business partners, and then military, and then now going off on this crazy adventure together. So we have a board of directors that are made up of 4 elected at-large individuals that are Fusion Center directors, and then we have 4 regional representatives from the regional co-chairs around there. So we wanted to make sure we had a diverse group of both major urban areas, states, as well as regional representation on our board. We also require that one of the board members be from, so we sometimes will have a 9th board member there, from a major city chief's intel commander's jurisdiction. We wanted to make sure we had that tight connection with the intel commanders that are out there in the field as well. So now, enough, well, the one other thing, we do not accept federal funding at all, any government funding at all. So we're not out there doing grants and that kind of things as many of the other associations do. We do provide a wealth of subject matter expertise through the directors, the analysts, and the other staff inside of Fusion Centers to folks that are executing on grant programs or executing on other projects for our federal partners. So enough of the NFC advertisement and on to Fusion Centers themselves. So when answering the question of what is a Fusion Center and how they come to be, I always like to tell folks that there's typically a derogatory statement used about Fusion Centers that I actually like. And it's that statement you hear that says, if you've seen one Fusion Center, you've seen one Fusion Center, right? People hear it and they use it in a negative connotation. There are those on the Hill that use it in a negative connotation. But I actually believe this is a positive statement in that the primary mission of a Fusion Center is to support its state and local customers. And since all state and local customers do not operate or organize in the same way, each Fusion Center has to adapt to meet those needs. One size doesn't fit all here, okay? So there are also regional considerations that play into the makeup of Fusion Center, such as proximity to an international border, port facilities within a jurisdiction, major metropolitan areas versus largely sparsely populated geographic areas. I would expect no one in this audience to believe that the Fusion Center in Montana should look exactly like the South Florida Fusion Center in Miami. They ought to be a little bit different. So when you break it down, a Fusion Center is a state and locally owned, operated analytics support center. And even though each center may be made a little different, they all perform some key common functions. And within this network, we refer to these functions as the critical operational capabilities, or the COCs. And these are very core to how Fusion Centers operate today. This is the common thread that pulls them all together. And I'll go through them briefly with you here. The first critical operational capability is to receive. These are they're going to sound pretty simplistic, but there's a lot that goes into this, okay? But the ability to receive classified and unclassified information from federal partners. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward, but in 2001, this had never been done before, passing classified information to state and local partners out there in the field to give decision makers, governors and mayors, information on threat-based stuff. This was all new stuff. The cultures were different. Everything was completely different. Analyze, the second COC. Ability to assess local implications of threat information through the use of formal risk assessment process, okay? And then to disseminate. So back to analyze for a second. The key there is that local implications, right? Not to just take a message that comes from various agency, tear off the top of the page, slap your logo on it, and send it out to every jurisdiction in your area. It's to add that local value added. What does that mean for that chief, that governor, that mayor? Is a risk implication of a threat stream that's coming in? Is it even relevant to your AOR? Disseminate, the ability to further disseminate threat information to other state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector entities within their jurisdiction. Pretty straightforward there. But again, this is a new process of now taking federal information coming from there and putting it out to a group of folks that have never received information like this before. Gather, ability to gather locally generated information, aggregate it, analyze it, and share it with federal partners as appropriate. That brings in all sorts of things. You've obviously heard about the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative and other things out there that help support that piece of the critical operational capabilities. Now, each year, DHS assesses each regional recognized Fusion Center on its ability to perform on the COCs, and the use of grant funding from Homeland Security is tied to the enhancement of the critical operational capabilities. Now, I need to back up here a little bit and answer how do Fusion Centers come about. And this is a very important point to understanding Fusion Centers and how they differ from what you've heard about previously about HIDAs and RISs, okay? it's pretty obvious that fusion centers came about as a direct response to the events of 9/11. And in fact, many of the centers perform each day, meeting some of the key recommendations of the 9/11 Commission every day. Continue to do that today after that commission report came out. What is interesting is there's not a law out there authorizing or appropriating funds for fusion centers. It's not a law. You can't point to anything that says that is where the federal government said there should be fusion centers. So when you have HIDAs and you have RISAs, these are federal programs that were put together using state and local resources under a common umbrella with a lot of federal direction and guidance. Doesn't happen that way with fusion centers. Fusion centers came about as a state and local idea, as a way to coordinate analytic and information sharing activities within states and major urban areas. They were organically grown. The early days of fusion centers were very ad hoc, and each center was a pretty independent entity. The notion of a national network of fusion centers did not exist. Early on, fusion centers, such as what was then called the California Anti-Terrorism Intelligence Center, or CATIC, actually received information directly from the Defense Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies with no coordination at the federal level at all. It was literally the Wild West of flowing information. And I'm going to give you a pretty funny story about one such incident you may remember from television back in 2001 when the country was pretty scared on a daily basis of what was going to happen, from crop dusters to bridges to et cetera. And that story is about a specific threat that was pushed to California in November 2001. One Monday morning, then Governor Gray Davis was holding a press conference at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge talking about a threat that had come in over the weekend and the measures the state was taking to protect the Bay Area bridges. Now, the somewhat funny part about this is that the information on the threat went directly from an intelligence agency to California over the weekend, and it was from an extremely highly classified TSSCI Plus report. And there was the governor. And on Monday morning, the FBI wakes up and sees the governor there. And they have this message sitting in front of them. And there's the governor releasing what they then believe is highly classified information on national television. Now, the intelligence agency that actually gave the information to California has something referred to in the community as declassification authority, where the FBI doesn't. And I always give the FBI a little bit of credit here, because everybody criticizes the FBI on not being able to share information, especially classified information. Well, typically the FBI is getting that information from other intelligence agencies and do not have the authority to disclose it. Whereas an originating agency such as this had the ability to declassify it, make it unclassified, put a tear line on it, and get it out to California, and it showed up. Now, obviously something had to be done to formalize how the federal government coordinated activities with state and local partners. At the time, all of this was very new, as I mentioned before, never been done before. For the most part, governors and mayors had never needed or been exposed to threat information of this type. Eventually, DHS came to be as the executive agent for all things fusion centers and ensures that information is coordinated across the Title 50 intelligence community members, both for information disseminated to fusion centers as well as information coming from fusion centers. Now, let's move forward a little bit to today on how does one become a fusion center and under whose authority are the functions mentioned earlier performed. Does anybody here know how a fusion, without not Glenn and not Ben, how do you become a fusion center? Does anybody know? How does one become a DHS-recognized fusion center? It's an interesting question, right? It takes the governor to designate it. Every governor in every state designates a primary fusion center and can designate what they call designated fusion centers in major urban areas within the state at his or her discretion. And they send that as a formal letter process and an MOU with the Department of Homeland Security. And that's how fusion centers come to be. So they still, to this day, are state and local derived. They operate under the authorities of the governors of the states, okay? And the governor decides where the fusion center fits inside of his or her enterprise, whether it sits where most of them sit within the primary law enforcement agency in the state, but we do have cases where they report directly to the Homeland Security advisors, or they report through the Emergency Management Agency when that EMA sometimes is the Homeland Security advisor as well. There's not one size, again, fits all on where a governor wants that fusion center to exist. But ultimately, it's the governor that makes that decision, okay? So now that we all have a better understanding a little bit about fusion centers and how they came to be, what do we mean when we say this term, National Network of Fusion Centers? I was first asked this question by a Senate staff person, and I looked back at him with a blank stare because it was obvious to me and everyone else within the network what we meant by the National Network of Fusion Centers. The problem was, and still is that there's not a definition of the National Network of Fusion Centers. It doesn't exist out there yet. And we'll talk a little bit about that on our ongoing work with the national strategy, in which we're going to help with a lot of our other public safety and emergency management partners begin to define what we do actually mean when we say the National Network of Fusion Centers. So even though there's not yet a formal definition, I'm going to attempt to articulate what is typically meant when using the term the National Network of Fusion Centers. And as fusion centers have matured in the area of common understanding of function, they've also matured in horizontal collaboration. When initially envisioned, fusion centers' functions were focused primarily on vertical sharing, up to the federal government and down from the federal government. That's still reflected in the COCs that we talked about earlier. When you looked at that dissemination piece, it says in the last three words, I was just talking to DHS about this today, it still says in their jurisdiction. Doesn't talk about other jurisdictions. But what we're finding today is that the COCs have had an unintended added benefit of creating a common understanding of function from one fusion center to another, and this has led to an increase in horizontal sharing. The Boston bombing was an example of horizontal and vertical sharing happening at the same time in response to a terrorist event. In one case, horizontal sharing of the suspect's images across the fusion center network prevented potential privacy violations. In this instance, a governor's office requested that facial recognition of images put out by the media be run against the state DMV photos. Because the Fusion Center had suspect images from Boston, they were able to let the governor's office know that the images the media were putting out were bogus and should not be run through the state DMV, thus protecting the privacy and civil rights and civil liberties of those people that the media really obviously didn't care about, but we did. So there are countless examples that take place every day on horizontal sharing in Fusion Center, and we could spend the rest of all of today talking about things. I've testified on many of them. Ben writes the testimony, I don't. About specific instances where fusion centers and horizontal sharing, whether you're talking about sovereign citizen or other domestic terrorist type of groups, have led to arrests and to the foiling of plots. Now, on to what may be a little more practical for this audience, and that is the subject of the overall fusion center market. I still find this data just fascinating every time I look at it. The data I'm going to use for this is from 2012, from 2011 and 2012. The 2013 data is currently being crunched by DHS and hopefully will be available in the next month or so. Okay. In 2012, there were 2,173 total state, local, territorial, or tribal personnel working in the then 77 fusion centers, producing over 86,000 products. Okay, it's quite a lot for a fairly young, immature organization. Of those, there were a total of 984 personnel designated as analysts, and the average age of the Fusion Center was only 6 years old. All in all, a fairly young market. But when you think of the average age of 6 years, that ought to mean something to a lot of folks in this audience. It's typically the point in which technology refreshes occur, in that 5 to 7, sometimes 8 or 9 in law enforcement, but typically the 5 to 7 period is where technology refreshes start to occur. And with the average age of the Fusion Center being 6 years old, we're beginning to see great improvements in some of the analytic platforms and intelligence management systems being used by the centers out there today. We're also seeing great improvements in some of the federal systems utilized by fusion centers for information sharing and dissemination. I'll pick on HISN for a minute. There used to be, HISN was a 4-letter word to many of the fusion center directors. They didn't like it. And I always liked it when I was in the grants world, I always likened it to the haves and the have-nots. And I'll pick on Ray Gadetti from New Jersey. New Jersey is what I call a have state. They got a lot of grant dollars. Louisiana, not so much a have state. They didn't get a lot of grant dollars. But when Ray Gadetti went down to do Super Bowl planning for this year's Super Bowl, he went down and saw what the Louisiana State Police had done with HISN. And he was floored. Because Louisiana had to make what they had work. They also had a good mission advocate from DHS that was there that helped them build the system out and really do a good job. New Jersey didn't have that. They had the funding to do other things and that kind of thing, and their mission advocate maybe wasn't the best mission advocate in the world to help them build out that site. Today we're seeing a lot more use of HISN. Every event that takes place in the United States today, they stand up a HISN Connect site and what's called a sit-aware room. 4th of July, MLK 50, major events, it'll go out on the net that the sit-aware room's out there. And the sit-aware room is where you go for anything that happens during that event, okay? And it's used across the spectrum. After a couple of after the Connecticut issues, the people started developing mutual, for lack of a better word, I mean, you misuse a word here, but lack of a better word, mutual aid agreements, that if an incident happens in your AOR, one of your neighboring fusion centers will stand up the sit-aware room and do that work for you. That happened during the Boston bombing, where the Connecticut folks actually stood up the sit-aware room and was getting the information from Boston and making everybody aware of what was going on, thus keeping the Boston folks focused on the response and recovery efforts that they needed to do. So as far as funding goes, the DHS policies that have encouraged states to utilize grant funding for fusion centers has had an incredible impact. In 2011, federal grants expended on fusion centers totaled over $52 million. And in 2012, that number increased to over $71 million. At the same time, grant funding was going down in those 2 years. So as a percentage of the whole, actually fusion centers were not just getting more money on a year-over-year basis, they're getting a bigger percentage of the pie, which is telling you a couple different things. One, the federal government's placing emphasis on this, on fusion centers, and their development of their critical operational capabilities. And it's also telling you that Homeland Security advisors, state administrative agents, grant administrators at the state level are placing increased emphasis on their fusion centers because that's what their customers are telling them. So I read all these derogatory things out here, but then I look at the metrics of, people vote with money a lot, right? You're gonna spend money on this or on that. Well, people would not be spending money on fusion centers if they didn't see any perceived derived value. There's a lot of other competing priorities out there. All right, so at the more macro level, just to give you a total view of the funding, total funding for fusion centers in 2011 was $267 million, and in 2012 it grew to over $304 million. Now I'm gonna boggle your mind here a little bit, at least it boggles my mind a little bit more. That's a 14% increase in a declining year, okay? Now, not only is that happening, that the 14% increase in a year in which funding from the federal government, direct funding to support fusion centers, went down by 21%. Okay? That's the other funding not grant related. So that funding's going down and the overall's going up 14%. You're seeing a drastic, if I had the pie charts I'd show them, but I really suck at PowerPoint. So what it shows is a huge increase in state and municipal funding going towards fusion centers. Really showing that this, well, the majority of funding is also state and local. It's not federal funding. That's another myth that we have to put out there, is that it is truly a shared responsibility with the greatest burden of that share sitting on state and local budgets, okay? And even in a declining market, those budgets for fusion centers continue to increase. All right, so finally I'd like to discuss where the network's going. Today the network continues to mature in both mission and capabilities. We're seeing fusion centers provide support to a broad spectrum of Homeland Security needs beyond just counterterrorism. Somebody mentioned that earlier in one of the presentations that I heard. Today's fusion centers are supporting many different components of DHS to include Border Patrol, TSA, Coast Guard, and others. We saw New Jersey, after Hurricane Sandy, supporting intelligence-led disaster recovery efforts, directly supporting the emergency management community with actionable information to respond to Hurricane Sandy and to recover. Just incredible stuff that is happening out there. We're also seeing DHS and FBI putting more federal personnel in fusion centers as analysts and liaison officers. DHS has got a plan in place now where they have intelligence officers out there, but they're beginning to now actually deploy analysts into the field to sit side by side with state and local analysts. And the power behind that, once that's realized, is going to truly be incredible. I'd like to mention 3 examples of projects that may give a good idea of where the network's going. The first project we're working on is called the Centers of Analytic Excellence. Now, the idea behind this process comes from the challenge that we can't afford experts on every subject in every center, and we can't simply task experts across the centers as they're there to support their own missions. Now, coming from the intelligence community in my military career, we had an expert on everything, on a T-72 tank, on an SA-6 missile system. We had somebody that could break those down and understand them left every which way but Tuesday. Well, we can't afford that in every fusion center. What we have to do is be able to rely on that analytic tradecraft from fusion centers going forward. So I like to use the analogy of third-grade math. Of course, Bill Ford walks in the room when I used to bring up the word math. He's a former math major. Remember when that third-grade teacher didn't really care as much about the answer that you gave, but they cared about show the work. How'd you get there, right? And that's really, really important. And that's what we're trying to capture in the Centers of Analytic Excellence, is being able to share that analytic tradecraft so that an expert on human trafficking in multi-state interstate corridors can share that analysis and that tradecraft, not the product, the tradecraft, so that an analyst over here that may not be an exact expert in it can use that tradecraft on their own data to derive products for their own jurisdictions. It's a really interesting concept. And we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to share actual knowledge, not just data, okay? And then creating a continuous improvement process by where one analyst tweaks it, makes it better, and then puts it back up there. And you have competing analytic frameworks out there, and people will vote with their feet and pulling down analytic frameworks that make the most sense for what they're trying to accomplish. All right, another project we have underway is what's called the National Priority Cell. You heard me talk about the missions of fusion centers have kind of gone the gambit now of homeland security beyond just counterterrorism. Think of the National Priority Cell, and this was one of the recommendations out of the House Majority Report that came out recently from Chairman McCall. Think of it as that unblinking eye that's out there in the fusion center that's focused on the terrorism mission, not forgetting that fact of why fusion centers came to be. Now, there's a lot more behind this that I don't have time to go in on this, but it came out of a paper written by Ray Gadetti doing a fellowship at DHS a couple years back, and it's been picked up by other folks and kind of changed and morphed a little bit. And we're starting a pilot with that, and the whole idea is taking the federal resources and the state and local resources and kind of putting them together in this cell, so that we have that unblinking brain trust, if you will, focused on that counterterrorism mission. All right, and lastly, I'd like to mention the work on the national strategy. Last fall, the House Homeland Committee published that previously mentioned report where Chairman McCall, really, we embraced that report. It had a lot of great recommendations, some of which we were already doing, some we weren't already doing. And I spoke at a Homeland Security Policy Institute event a few weeks back, before the holidays, and Chairman McCall came up to me and said, Ross, you have to develop this national strategy. That's the key finding in this whole report, because you have to tell us how to help you. And because there's a lot of money going towards it, there are a lot of folks that don't understand what the money's being used for, and a lot of folks that need to understand there needs to be a well-defined strategy that's easy to articulate to 530 some odd folks on the other side of the river over there, on what it is fusion centers do and where are they going, and include that definition of what do we mean when we say a national network of fusion centers. What does that mean? And it has to have, it's a balancing act in this strategy. Because remember, they're state and locally owned and operated. So there has to be a very well-grounded state and local benefit that's out there. But at the same time, we have to have that federal benefit out there because the federal government's investing a substantial amount of money in this shared responsibility. So that's got to be out there as well. So we've brought together our public safety partners, especially those that own and operate the centers, and are the bosses of our fusion center directors out there that direct them on a daily basis. And we brought them together along with Fire Emergency Management and the National Governors Association, because governors designate fusion centers, to work on this strategy. And this strategy development team that we've pulled together has been operating for not quite a month now, maybe about a month, I believe. And working on developing this strategy. And the strategy, development team is led by an executive steering committee chaired by Bart Johnson from the IACP. He's got a little bit of experience with fusion centers. and includes representatives from ASHA, major city chiefs, major county sheriffs, as well as former FEMA Administrator David Paulson. We hope to have the draft strategy published at the beginning of March, and we'll be submitting it to the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council for their vetting process going forward. So, I covered quite a bit here today, and really you could spend days diving down into each of the different areas I gave a summary of. And I'll be around for most of the afternoon, happy to answer questions you may have, or sidebar discussions and things of that nature. But really the goal here was to give you kind of a high-level broad brush of those 4 areas that we're undertaking, and hopefully you got some good information out of that. So again, I'd like to conclude by thanking Steve and the IGES board again for including us in your meetings. IGES has supported the National Fusion Center Association as a partner from the very beginning, from helping get the word out to our events to including us in programs like this. So have a great rest of the day and a productive set of meetings. Thank you very much.